Lieutenant James Jimmy Hartwell pressed the tiny pencil stub against the scrap of cigarette paper, his hands trembling, not from fear but from the careful concentration required to write letters, so small they could barely be seen. Around him, the darkness of Cabanatuan Camp's barracks hummed with the restless sleep of dying men. It was August 1944, and Jimmy had been a prisoner for 2.5 years. The mind is the only territory they cannot occupy, he whispered to himself, a mantra he'd repeated 1,000 times since Bataan fell. The pencil stub had cost him 3 days' rice ration, traded to a guard who'd found it in the commandant's office. The paper had come from Private Eddie Chen, who'd somehow managed to salvage it from a discarded Lucky Strike pack during their last forced march to the fields. Every resource in the camp had value, but information that was worth more than gold. Jimmy finished the final character of his coded message and carefully folded the paper into a microscopic square. Tomorrow, when they marched to the farming detail, he would slip it into the hollowed-out handle of the work hoe that the Filipino resistance checked every 3 days. The message contained something that could change everything: the location of the camp's ammunition depot, guard rotation schedules, and the structural weaknesses in the camp's eastern fence. Intelligence gathered through months of careful observation, memorized numbers counted during endless work details, patterns noticed in the chaos of survival. But intelligence was only half the battle. Staying alive long enough to use it, that was the real challenge. The guard's footsteps echoed outside. Jimmy slipped the folded paper into the hem of his tattered shorts, where he'd unpicked and resewn the stitching so many times it could be opened and closed in seconds. As the door burst open and the guard's flashlight swept across the barracks, Jimmy's face remained slack, his breathing steady. He had learned to sleep with his eyes slightly open, a trick that made him appear unconscious even when fully alert. The guard moved on. In the darkness, Jimmy allowed himself the smallest smile. They could starve him, beat him, work him until his bones showed through his skin like bamboo scaffolding. But they couldn't stop him from thinking, watching, learning. And that made all the difference between existing and surviving. By morning, 3 men would be dead from disease. By noon, 2 more would collapse in the fields. But Jimmy's message would reach the resistance, and the invisible war, the war of quiet intelligence, would continue. This was how they would survive. Not through strength or weapons or the hope of rescue, but through the careful application of human ingenuity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Every prisoner who understood this became a weapon. Every observation became ammunition. Every small act of defiance became a victory. The war might be won on battlefields thousands of miles away, but in Cabanatuan, survival was its own form of warfare. Before the war, Dr. Samuel Harrison had taught engineering at Stanford University. Now in Block 7 of Cabanatuan, he taught something far more essential: the mathematics of survival. "Gentlemen," he whispered to the 6 men huddled in the corner of the barracks during the precious 20 minutes between evening roll call and lights out, "protein deficiency will kill you in 6 months. Biribiri will take you in 4. But stupidity will kill you today." The men, ranging from a farm boy from Iowa to a jazz musician from New Orleans, listened with the intensity of students facing a final exam, because in a sense they were. Every day was a test, and failure meant death. Harrison had organized what prisoners secretly called the University, an invisible network of knowledge sharing that spread across the camp like mycelium through soil. It operated on a simple principle: pooled intelligence increased everyone's odds of survival. "Water from the north well has fewer parasites than the south," contributed Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a former biology teacher. "Boil it if you can, but if you can't, let it sit for 6 hours. The sediment carries the worst of it." The guards changed shifts at 0600, 1400, and 2200, added Corporal Tom Nakamura, a Japanese-American translator who'd been captured in the Philippines. His language skills made him invaluable, but also dangerous. The guards suspected him of everything. The morning shift is the most brutal. They're fresh. The evening shift is tired and careless. That's when you take risks. Private Eddie Chen, the youngest at 19, had a photographic memory. "I've memorized the entire camp layout," he said, his finger tracing invisible lines in the dirt. 23 guard towers, 16 blind spots in their sight lines. The commissary receives shipments every 11 days. The commandant meets with the officers every Tuesday at 1500 hours in the administration building. This was the university's curriculum: practical intelligence, survival science, and the systematic documentation of everything the Japanese believed was beneath notice. The prisoners had learned that their captors saw them as subhuman, which meant they often acted as if the prisoners couldn't see, couldn't think, couldn't remember. It was a fatal error in judgment. Harrison had developed what he called caloric cartography, a detailed map of every possible food source in the camp. He knew which guards could be bribed with handmade items, which work details offered the chance to steal vegetables, which rats were safe to eat, and which carried disease. He'd calculated the minimum number of calories needed to avoid starvation, 800 per day, though the Japanese provided barely 500. The gap between 500 and 800 is the gap you must fill with intelligence, Harrison lectured. Every extra grain of rice you obtain through careful observation, every grasshopper you catch because you notice the pattern of their movement, every moment you avoid a beating because you learned to read the guards' moods, that's applied intelligence. That's survival. But the university taught more than just survival tactics. It taught men how to remain human in conditions designed to strip away humanity. Father Miguel Ramirez, a chaplain from New Mexico, led what he called memory exercises. Each night, different men would describe in excruciating detail a meal from their past, not just what they ate, but the texture, the smell, the company, the weather that day, the conversation around the table. These descriptions served dual purposes. They kept minds sharp through detailed recall, and they fed a different kind of hunger. "My mama's tamales," Private Rodriguez would begin, his voice carrying across the dark barracks. "Christmas Eve, 1939. She'd wake up at 4 in the morning to soak the corn husks." As Rodriguez spoke, men would close their eyes and construct the meal in their minds, engaging memory centers of the brain that helped maintain cognitive function. Harrison had read about this in a psychology journal years ago. Vivid recall exercises could stave off the mental deterioration that often accompanied extreme malnutrition. The university also included a clandestine medical school. Dr. Paul Chen, no relation to Eddie, had been a surgeon in Manila. With no medical supplies, he taught men diagnostic skills using only observation. "Yellow eyes mean liver problems, probably from malnutrition or hepatitis," he instructed. "Swollen ankles mean beriberi. Treat it with rice bran, if you can steal it from the animal feed. Skin that stays tented when you pinch it means dehydration. Dark urine means kidney stress. You need water immediately, whatever the cost." Men learned to diagnose each other, to spot the early signs of diseases that could be treated if caught soon enough. They became experts in reading their own bodies, understanding that the first symptom of illness was precious warning time to take action. Perhaps most remarkably, the university operated a covert intelligence service. Every prisoner who interacted with guards was debriefed. Every scrap of overheard conversation was analyzed. Every change in routine was noted and interpreted. It was through this network that Jimmy Hartwell learned about the ammunition depot. It was through this network that they tracked which guards were cruel and which could be manipulated. It was through this network that they learned months before official word reached them that the tide of war was turning in the Pacific. The Japanese thought they'd captured soldiers. They didn't realize they'd imprisoned an intelligence organization. Sergeant Frank Morrison was a thief, and he'd never been better at his craft than he was in Cabanatuan. Before the war, he'd been a mechanic in Detroit, the kind of man who could look at an engine and understand its secrets. In the camp, he'd become something else. A master of the invisible heist, stealing from the Japanese in ways so subtle they never even knew they'd been robbed. "The trick," he explained to his small crew during a rare moment of privacy, "is never to take enough that they notice it's gone. You don't steal the whole bag of rice. You steal a handful a day for a month. By the time they realize the inventory doesn't match, there's no way to trace it back." Morrison had organized what the prisoners called the Redistribution Committee, though the Japanese would have called it an organized theft ring. It consisted of 12 men, each with specialized skills, who systematically diverted resources from the Japanese to the prisoners. There was Johnny Fingers Delgado, who'd been a watchmaker, and could pick any lock in the camp with tools made from bamboo splinters and scavenged wire. There was Big Pete Kowalski, who worked in the camp kitchen and had perfected the art of creative accounting with the food supplies. There was Martin Lee, an accountant who kept meticulous mental records of everything they'd stolen, ensuring the operation never left evidence. But Morrison's masterpiece wasn't theft. It was manufacturing. Using materials stolen over 6 months, scraps of metal, broken tools, pieces of wire, Morrison and his team had built a radio. Not a complete radio, which would have been impossible to hide, but a modular one. Each component was small enough to be concealed separately. When assembled in secret after the guards' final inspection of the night, it could pick up Allied broadcasts from Australia. The radio changed everything. On a humid night in June 1944, Morrison assembled the components in a hollowed-out section beneath the barracks floorboards. 10 men crowded around in the darkness as he attached the final wire. Static crackled, then a voice emerged, an Australian broadcaster, distant but clear. Allied forces have successfully landed on the beaches of Normandy. The men froze. Normandy, France, Europe. The war was moving forward. They weren't forgotten. But even more valuable than morale was intelligence. The radio broadcasts provided information about Japanese military movements, Allied advances, and the overall progress of the war. This information was coded, memorized, and passed through the university network. It gave them context for understanding the Japanese guards' behavior, for predicting when the camp might be moved, or when conditions might worsen. Knowledge was power, and in a place where prisoners had no physical power, information became their only currency. Morrison's crew expanded their operations. They began sabotaging Japanese equipment in ways that appeared to be natural wear and tear. A truck's engine would develop mysterious problems because someone had mixed sand into the oil during a maintenance detail. Work tools would break at convenient moments because metal fatigue had been encouraged with careful filing in invisible locations. These small acts of resistance rarely changed outcomes significantly, but they accomplished something perhaps more important. They reminded the prisoners that they still had agency. "Every bolt I loosen," Morrison once said, "is a vote that I'm still human, that I'm still in this fight." The invisible rebellion extended beyond sabotage. Prisoners developed elaborate systems of non-compliance that operated just below the threshold of punishment. They would deliberately misunderstand orders, forcing guards to spend extra time explaining tasks. They would work at the minimum possible pace, choreographing their movements to appear busy while accomplishing little. They would accidentally damage Japanese property in ways that seemed like honest mistakes. One of the most sophisticated operations was the document forgery unit, run by a former art teacher named David Brennan. Using ink made from crushed berries and charcoal, paper stolen from the administration office, and stamps carved from carved potato pieces, Brennan could create convincing Japanese documents. These forgeries were used to facilitate the redistribution of resources. A forged work order could send prisoners to areas where they could steal supplies. A forged medical note could excuse someone from a brutal work detail. The forgeries had to be perfect. A single mistake could mean execution. Brennan spent weeks studying captured Japanese documents, memorizing the exact formation of each character, the precise spacing, the specific way official stamps were applied. His work was so convincing that forged documents sometimes circulated through Japanese administrative channels for days before anyone questioned them. But the most daring operation came in September 1944, when Morrison's crew stole the camp commandant's personal sake supply over the course of 2 months, replacing it with water colored with tea extract. By the time the commandant discovered the switch, there was no way to determine when or how it had happened. The entire camp was punished with reduced rations for a week, but the psychological victory was worth it. The message was clear: nowhere was safe from the prisoners' reach. These acts of resistance were dangerous, often resulting in brutal punishment if discovered, but they served a crucial psychological purpose. In a system designed to break men's spirits by removing all control, these small rebellions restored a sense of agency. They proved that even in the most oppressive circumstances, intelligence and creativity could carve out spaces of freedom. Corporal Tom Nakamura lived in 2 worlds, and both wanted him dead. To the Japanese guards, he was a traitor, an ethnic Japanese who'd chosen American citizenship and fought against the emperor. To some of the American prisoners, he was a potential collaborator, someone whose face reminded them of their captors. Nakamura's survival required navigating this impossible middle ground with perfect precision. But his bilingual abilities made him the most valuable intelligence asset in Cabanatuan. "They say things in front of me," Nakamura explained to Jimmy Hartwell during one of their secret meetings. "They assume I won't understand military terminology, or they think I'm too cowed to pay attention. But I understand everything." Nakamura had developed a system for gathering intelligence that was breathtaking in its audacity. When translating for the guards, he would deliberately mistranslate in ways that benefited the prisoners while appearing to be faithful to the original Japanese. A guard's order to work faster or face punishment would become work steadily to avoid injury. A commandant's demand for absolute obedience would be softened to cooperation and respect. These subtle shifts in translation created a buffer between the guard's brutality and the prisoner's survival. Nakamura was essentially rewriting the rules of the camp in real time, and the Japanese never suspected. But his greatest contribution was his ability to gather advance warning. One evening in October 1944, Nakamura was summoned to translate documents in the administration building. While waiting, he overheard two officers discussing an upcoming inspection by a high-ranking general from Tokyo. The camp needed to appear well-run, which meant prisoners would receive better food and treatment for 3 days before the inspection, followed by harsh reprisals afterward to restore discipline. Nakamura immediately passed this intelligence to the university network. Harrison and Morrison developed a plan. Prisoners would appear gaunt and mistreated during the inspection, contradicting the narrative the camp commandant wanted to present. They would work slowly, deliberately showing their exhaustion. A few men would stage realistic-looking collapses. The gambit worked. The general reprimanded the camp commandant for the poor condition of the prisoners, noting that workers in such poor health couldn't contribute effectively to the war effort. The camp's rations were increased, and the planned reprisals never materialized. A victory achieved through nothing more than theatrical intelligence. Nakamura also became the camp's emotional intelligence officer. He could read the guards' moods with uncanny accuracy, predicting when violence was likely and warning prisoners to make themselves scarce. He understood the hierarchies within the Japanese command structure, knowing which guards had power and which were just cruel. Guard Tanaka is dangerous when his superior officer is present. He performs brutality to impress, Nakamura explained to a group of new prisoners. But alone he's frightened and can be avoided. Guard Matsumoto is consistently cruel. Never make eye contact. Never give him a reason to notice you. Guard Saito has a sick child in Osaka. He's sometimes sympathetic if you appear to be working hard. This kind of intelligence was as valuable as any military information. It allowed prisoners to navigate the camp's social landscape, avoiding danger and occasionally finding unexpected mercy. But Nakamura paid a personal price for his role. The psychological strain of constantly translating, constantly performing, constantly walking the line between two cultures that both rejected him, created wounds that never healed. He confided once to Father Ramirez that he sometimes forgot which language he was dreaming in, whether he was Japanese or American, or something broken between the two. "You're human," Ramirez told him. "That's the only identity that matters here." Nakamura's work extended beyond translation. He taught other prisoners basic Japanese phrases, not enough to be fluent, but enough to understand orders and avoid punishment. He explained Japanese cultural concepts that helped prisoners predict guard behavior. He was, in essence, teaching the enemy's language as a survival tool. One of his most important lessons was about the concept of saving face in Japanese culture. If you embarrass a guard in front of others, he will destroy you to restore his honor, Nakamura explained. But if you allow him to save face even in defeat, he may show mercy. Give them victories that cost you nothing. Bow lower. Acknowledge their authority with your posture, even as you resist with your actions. This understanding of cultural psychology allowed prisoners to engage in what Harrison called strategic submission, appearing to comply while actually maintaining their autonomy. It was a form of camouflage, hiding their true selves behind a performance of defeat. The intelligence gathered through Nakamura's translations also revealed something unexpected: divisions within the Japanese command. Some officers were true believers in the imperial cause, brutal and unyielding. Others were weary, homesick men who'd been fighting for years and wanted the war to end. Some were professional soldiers who treated prisoners according to military protocol. Others were sadists who used their power to indulge their worst impulses. Understanding these divisions allowed prisoners to exploit them. They could predict which officers might be bribed, which would respond to appeals to military honor, which were simply counting days until they could go home. In February 1945, Nakamura intercepted a conversation that chilled him to his core. The Japanese High Command had issued orders that if the Allies invaded the Philippines, all prisoners were to be executed to prevent their liberation. This information, carefully verified through multiple sources, changed the prisoners' strategic calculus entirely. Survival was no longer just about enduring. It was about preparing for the possibility that they would need to escape or fight when the time came. The intelligence flowed through the university network. Escape plans were refined. Men began stockpiling weapons, sharpened bamboo, rocks, anything that could be used in a final stand. Morrison's crew intensified their sabotage, preparing to disable Japanese vehicles and weapons if the order came. But they also continued the work of survival, because the best intelligence in the world meant nothing if they weren't alive to use it. January 1945. The camp was dying. Dr. Paul Chen stood in the makeshift hospital ward, really just a section of barracks where the sickest men were left to either recover or die, and counted corpses. 4 that morning, 7 the day before. The Japanese had cut rations again, and the daily caloric intake had dropped below 400. Men were walking skeletons, their bodies consuming themselves just to maintain consciousness. The quiet intelligence that had sustained them for years was reaching its limits. You couldn't think your way out of starvation. You couldn't outsmart disease when you had no medicine. You couldn't strategize your way past the simple mathematical fact that the human body needed fuel to function. "We're losing," Chen said to Harrison, during one of their increasingly desperate university meetings. "All our systems, all our knowledge, it's not enough anymore." Harrison looked around at the assembled men, seeing the defeat in their eyes. They'd survived through intelligence, through creativity, through sheer human ingenuity. But there were limits to what the mind could accomplish when the body was failing. "Then we changed the objective," Harrison said quietly. "We're not trying to save everyone anymore. We're trying to save enough that our knowledge survives." It was a brutal calculus, but it was honest. The university network shifted its focus. They began prioritizing the youngest men, those with the best chance of long-term survival. They documented everything they'd learned, encoding it in memory chains where information was distributed across multiple prisoners, so that even if some died, the knowledge would persist. Eddie Chen, with his photographic memory, became a living library. Every piece of intelligence, every survival technique, every tactical observation was committed to his memory. If the camp was liberated, or if they had a chance to escape, Eddie would be the vessel that carried their knowledge out. But even as they adapted their strategy, something unexpected happened. The intelligence they'd gathered over years began to pay dividends in ways they'd never anticipated. Morrison's radio picked up a broadcast in late January. American forces had landed in Luzon. The liberation of the Philippines had begun. The Japanese guards didn't know it yet, but the prisoners did, and that knowledge changed everything. "We don't need to survive indefinitely anymore," Jimmy Hartwell said, a wild hope creeping into his voice for the first time in years. "We just need to survive long enough." The university network went into overdrive. Using their intelligence about guard patterns, they identified the optimal time for a potential rescue, evening shift change. When the guards were most disorganized, they mapped escape routes, noting every blind spot in the guards' sight lines. They prepared contingency plans for different scenarios: if the Japanese decided to evacuate the camp, if they decided to execute the prisoners, if American forces attacked. Nakamura provided the most crucial intelligence. The Japanese were preparing to move the prisoners inland, away from the advancing American forces. The move would be brutal, and many prisoners wouldn't survive it. But it also meant they would be leaving the camp, moving through territory where escape might be possible. "We need to be ready to act," Harrison said. "We've been gathering intelligence for years. Now we use it." The quiet intelligence transformed into preparation for action. Men who'd been surviving began training themselves to fight. They practiced moving silently, communicating without words, coordinating actions across groups. They studied the guards' weapons, learning how they worked so they could use them if the opportunity arose. Morrison's crew accelerated their sabotage. They damaged Japanese vehicles so severely that repair was impossible, reducing the camp's transportation capacity. They contaminated fuel supplies with water. They stole ammunition, hiding it in locations only the prisoners knew about. But they also had to maintain appearances. The Japanese couldn't suspect that anything had changed. So prisoners continued their routines, appearing defeated while secretly preparing for whatever came next. The psychological transformation was remarkable. Men who'd been shuffling through days in a haze of exhaustion suddenly moved with purpose. The university meetings took on a new character. They were no longer just survival discussions, but tactical planning sessions. "If the guards try to march us inland, we slow them down," Jimmy proposed. "Every delay gives American forces more time to reach us. We use everything we know about sabotage, about the terrain, about manipulating the guards. And if they try to execute us?" someone asked. "Then we fight," Morrison said simply. "We're dead anyway. Might as well take some of them with us." Father Ramirez objected to the violence. But even he understood the mathematics of survival had changed. They'd spent years preserving life through intelligence. Now intelligence was teaching them that violence might be the only path to survival. In the final days of January, Nakamura overheard a conversation that electrified the entire camp. American Rangers were planning a rescue mission. The Japanese officers were discussing increased security measures to prevent a raid, which meant a raid was coming. The intelligence spread through the university network in hours. Every prisoner was briefed on what to do when the attack came. Stay low, move toward the American forces when they breached the perimeter. Don't run. The guards might mistake them for escaping prisoners and shoot. Wait for clear signals. They'd spent years preparing for survival. Now they had mere days to prepare for liberation. On the evening of January 30th, 1945, as the sun set over Cabanatuan, the prisoners waited. Their bodies were broken, their resources exhausted, but their minds remained sharp. They'd survived through intelligence, through the systematic application of human ingenuity against impossible odds. And when the shooting started, when American Rangers came through the fence, when the camp erupted into chaos, the quiet intelligence that had sustained them for years guided them through the confusion. They knew where to go, because they'd mapped every inch of the camp. They knew how to move, because they'd studied escape routes for months. They knew to stay calm, because panic killed. The liberation of Cabanatuan would be remembered as one of the most successful rescue missions in military history. But what most historians wouldn't record was that it succeeded in part because the prisoners weren't helpless victims waiting to be saved. They were intelligence operatives who'd been preparing for this moment for years. Lieutenant Jimmy Hartwell sat in a clean hospital bed in a facility in Leyte, Philippines, 3 weeks after the liberation. He weighed 89 pounds. He'd entered Cabanatuan at 165. Around him, former prisoners were receiving treatment, processing the shock of freedom, beginning the long journey home. But Jimmy couldn't stop thinking about the men who hadn't made it. Of the 513 prisoners rescued from Cabanatuan, Jimmy had known 492 by name. He'd also known the names of 1,847 men who died in the camp over 3 years. He remembered their faces, their stories, the specific diseases or beatings or failures of will that had killed them. The intelligence gathering that had saved his life had also created a perfect record of everyone he couldn't save. "I keep thinking we could have done more," he told Dr. Chen, who was in a bed 3 down. "If we'd been smarter, faster, better organized—" "Stop," Chen interrupted. "We saved lives, hundreds of lives. The systems we built, the knowledge we shared, those things made the difference between dying in 6 months and surviving for 3 years. Without the university, without Morrison's crew, without Nakamura's intelligence, none of us would be here." It was true, but it didn't feel like enough. Eddie Chen visited later that day. The young private had been transferred to intelligence debriefing. The military wanted everything he remembered, every piece of intelligence the prisoners had gathered. His photographic memory made him invaluable. "They're treating us like heroes," Eddie said, his voice uncertain. "But I didn't fight anyone. I just remembered things." "You fought," Jimmy said firmly, "just not with weapons. You fought with your mind. That's what all of us did." Over the following weeks, as prisoners were processed and debriefed, a clearer picture emerged of what they'd accomplished. The intelligence they'd gathered about Japanese military operations, command structures, supply lines, and tactical procedures was extensive. The sabotage operations had caused measurable delays in Japanese war efforts in the region. The survival systems they'd developed were being documented and shared with other camps. But perhaps most importantly, they'd proved something about human resilience. They'd demonstrated that even in the most oppressive circumstances, intelligence could create spaces of autonomy, that the mind could resist, even when the body was captive, that creativity and knowledge could be weapons as powerful as any gun. Harrison was interviewed by a military historian who was documenting the camp's liberation. "How did you survive?" the historian asked. "We built a university in hell," Harrison answered. "We taught each other that survival wasn't just about not dying, it was about maintaining our humanity, our capacity to think, to learn, to adapt. We survived because we refused to stop being intelligent." Morrison was asked about the sabotage operations. "Weren't you afraid of being caught?" "Every day," Morrison admitted. "But fear is just another problem to solve. We calculated risks, developed systems to minimize detection, created redundancies so that if one person was caught, the operation could continue. We applied intelligence to rebellion." Nakamura faced different questions. "You were Japanese American. How did the guards treat you?" "They despised me," Nakamura said quietly. "But their contempt made them underestimate me. They never imagined I was the source of so much intelligence leaking from their conversations. I survived because I understood something they didn't. Information is more powerful than hate." Father Ramirez was asked about the psychological aspects of survival. "Many prisoners suffered from despair, from loss of will. How did your group maintain hope?" "We didn't always," Ramirez admitted. "But we created systems that didn't depend on hope. We built routines that kept minds active even when spirits were broken. We shared knowledge that gave men a sense of purpose even in purposeless circumstances. Hope is fragile. Intelligence is robust." As the months passed and prisoners returned home, they carried with them not just memories of suffering, but also lessons about survival. Some became teachers, sharing what they'd learned about human resilience. Some went into intelligence work, applying their hard-won expertise to the Cold War that was emerging. Some simply tried to forget, though the knowledge they'd accumulated never fully left them. The story of Cabanatuan would be told many times over the years. Books would be written, documentaries filmed, monuments erected. But the most important aspect of the story was often overlooked. It wasn't a story about endurance or luck or waiting for rescue. It was a story about agency, about the systematic application of human intelligence to seemingly impossible problems. The prisoners of Cabanatuan survived not because they were stronger or luckier than others. They survived because they were smarter, because they built systems, shared knowledge, gathered intelligence, and adapted their strategies as circumstances changed. They survived because they understood that the mind, properly applied, was the ultimate survival tool. Jimmy Hartwell eventually returned to his hometown in Pennsylvania. He became a teacher, which surprised those who knew him before the war. He'd been studying to be a lawyer, but he'd learned something in Cabanatuan about the power of education, about how knowledge could literally save lives. On the first day of school each year, he would tell his students a simplified version of his story. "I survived a prisoner of war camp," he would say, "by learning everything I could about my environment, by sharing knowledge with others, by using my intelligence as a weapon when I had no other weapons. You will face different challenges in your lives, but the principle remains the same. The educated mind is the free mind, no matter what circumstances try to confine you." His students would sometimes ask if he hated the Japanese for what they'd done to him. Jimmy would shake his head. "I hated what was done. But I also learned that even in the worst circumstances, there were opportunities to apply intelligence, to resist, to survive. That's not a lesson about nationality or war. It's a lesson about what makes us human." Years later, When Eddie Chen published a memoir about his experiences, he dedicated it to the University of Cabanatuan, where men taught each other that the mind could remain free even when the body was captive. Morrison opened a garage in Detroit, returning to his mechanic roots. But he never stopped being an engineer of survival. When the neighborhood struggled with poverty in the 1950s, he organized community systems for sharing resources, pooling knowledge, and helping families navigate bureaucratic obstacles. Same principles as the camp, he'd say with a wry smile. Different application. Nakamura faced the hardest road. Japanese Americans returning from the war camps found their communities shattered by internment and prejudice. But he'd learned in Cabanatuan that survival meant building bridges between hostile worlds. He became a translator for the occupation forces in Japan, then later worked in diplomacy, using his understanding of both cultures to build understanding where there had been only hatred. Dr. Chen returned to medicine, but he never forgot the lessons of practicing without resources. He pioneered low-cost healthcare solutions for underserved communities, developing diagnostic techniques that didn't require expensive equipment. I learned in Cabanatuan, he wrote in a medical journal, that good medicine is about knowledge and observation, not just technology. The men of Cabanatuan scattered across America and around the world, but they carried with them a shared understanding: intelligence is survival's foundation, knowledge is freedom's prerequisite, and the human capacity to think, adapt, and learn is more durable than any prison. Their story became a testament not to suffering, but to the indomitable nature of human ingenuity. They had entered the camps as soldiers. They emerged as something else entirely, as proof that no circumstances, however brutal, can completely extinguish the light of human intelligence. And when they gathered for reunions in the decades that followed, fewer each year as time claimed what brutality hadn't, they would remind each other of the core truth that had saved them. The mind is the only territory they cannot occupy. That lesson, hard-won through years of deprivation and suffering, remained their victory. Not just survival, but survival with dignity. Not just endurance, but endurance with purpose. Not just waiting for rescue, but preparing for it, enabling it, deserving it. They had survived Japan's brutal camps, not through physical strength or military might, but through quiet intelligence. And in doing so, they'd written a different kind of war story, one where the greatest weapons were knowledge, creativity, and the unbreakable human spirit.